Let me first of all wish you all a very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and extend a very warm welcome on your behalf to Professor Kham Suan Hausing. He, as you all know, is going to speak to us today on the topical issue of intra-states disputes in the Northeast. And the title of his talk today is Fixing Fluid Boundaries, Security Anxiety, State Making, and Overlapping Territoriality in the Assam-Mizoram border. A brief word or two about his background. Professor Kham Suan Hausing is professor and head Department of Political Science, University of Hyderabad. And he did his master's, MPhil, PhD from JNU. He's been a Fulbright Nehru postdoctoral research fellow in the US, in the University of Pennsylvania. And his research interests includes, among other things, federalism, ethnic conflicts, nationalism, and Indian politics, with particular focus on the northeast of India. And as you all know, we have recently been following the intrastate events that have been unfolding and causing some alarm to all of us, particularly the manner in which things deteriorated between the states of Assam and Mizoram. And there have been, mutual recriminations. There have been references to different points of time in history, different agreements. And at present, the situation still remains somewhat tense. Central forces are deployed along the state borders, the SSB, the CRPF on the Assam side, and the BSF on the Mizoram side of the border, in order to act as a buffer between the state police forces. And efforts are on at the political level also to diffuse the tensions. The Home Secretary has convened a meeting of chief secretaries, and the idea is to arrive at some kind of an agreement. Some of these efforts have proved inconclusive so far. Now, the point here is that when I saw the title, I was reminded of international borders and issues. So this is not something we normally expect within the borders of a state, as in a country. But given the history, particularly of the Northeast, the colonial period, the post-colonial period, I suppose that this is, par for the course there. The fluidity with which even the British addressed some of these issues was difficult for others to understand. When we sift through various overlays of history, we come across these, various agreements and points of departure, points of inflection, which may be preferred by one group or the other. So there is, in this whole business of state making in the Northeast, the issue of the overlay of history, the enormity of history, the burden of history, and overlapping, claims and interpretations also. So I don't want to go into details, since I'm not an expert, and it is in fact Professor Kham Suan Hausing that we are here to listen to. So with these few words, once again, Professor, warm welcome to you. I'm so grateful to you for joining us this afternoon. And may I request you to kindly deliver your remarks today, your address. You can speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we can open it up to Q&A. I would request all panelists to kindly keep their mics on mute. All the attendees may kindly use the Q&A box at the bottom right corner of your screen for posing your questions, and they may kindly be kept questions so that I can sift through it with some kind of clarity, and then request the speaker to address your questions at the end of his talk. Over to you, Professor. Thank you.
Let me first of all thank Ambassador Chinoy and the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, New Delhi, the team, the excellent team working there, and especially Puspita for facilitating this talk. It has been a signal honor and privilege for me to deliver on a very topical issue which has important significance on interstate border issues, but also on the terms of engagement across the borders, which is considered to be geostrategically fragile and very important. So what I intend to do in this presentation is to map up some of the context and the key concept that I would be using in this lecture, and I would then subsequently devolve the next section on the problematics of state making and overlapping territoriality in the Assam-Mizoram border. Then I would also flag some of the difficulty, if not impossibility, of fixing fluid boundaries, especially like the one that obtained on the Assam-Mizoram border. And I'll conclude my talk with some concluding remarks. So defining the context and the key concept that I'll be using in this talk or lecture is important because if you look at or rehearse, the chains of events which unraveled in July, in the middle of July, and which culminated in the bloody violence that erupted on the Assam-Mizoram border, on the town of Vairenti, which is 6 kilometers deep into Mizoram border, which eventually led to the death of 6 armed Assam personnel. You would see that this violent event was a culmination of a series of events centered essentially around eviction drives in order to ensure that no encroachment happened in the future. So if you look at closely, this eviction drive has been one of the important election manifesto of the BJP, which in effect promised to bring to fruition, illegal settlement in many parts of Assam, and that, however, does not tell us very much about the larger, longer historical events which, in effect, visited this part of a problematic borderland. So you would see, for example, that the initial complaints of encroachment in the Assam-Mizoram border can be traced to the expansion of tea gardens, the raids, in effect, which were conducted by the Lusais upon the colonial Raj in the 1840s and in the 1850s and in the 1860s, which culminated in the Alexandrapur, raid leading to the killing of James Winchester, the tea garden manager, and the capture of his daughter Mary Winchester, and which eventually led to the Lusai expedition of 1871-72, is possibly one of the clearest example of how complaints of encroachment entailed violent conflict on the Assam-Kachar border, as it were, in the 1870s and subsequently in the 1890s. So you have this attempt to establish peace, to establish security, that is law and order, and that is to say that the idea of security anxiety, of establishing, of influencing the patterns of relationship across borders in ways which subserve to the interests of both parties, whether it is the state parties or whether it is the tribal groups which are involved in counter raids in order to kind of stop encroachment that the British entailed through enlargement and expansion of tea gardens, were very important reminders of how bloody these events could historically be. So you also have that as a result of this bloody conflict, which was entailed by the massive raids that the Lusai had unleashed upon the British Raj. You have this Lusai expedition, which succeeded in restoring a semblance of peace and security on the Assam-Kachar border. And subsequently, it also led to an occasion for the British Raj to map the border in more definitive terms. But as it were, because of the lack of human resources, because of the lack of technology, somehow fixing territorial borders along these areas, which continue to be fluid, which continue to be overlapping, remains difficult, if not impossible. So one of the ways in which the British ensure peace and its security concern, but also at the same time extend its commercial and trade interest on the border, is by way of promulgating what is called the Inner Line Reserve Forest Area via the Assam Forest Act of 1878, which in effect led to 509 square miles of territory, which hitherto had been claimed by the Lusai as incorporated as a part of the Inner Line Reserve. And as you might remember, that the 1871-72 Lusai expedition also led to the laying down of as many as 46 police outposts, which in effect was effectively used subsequently by 1875 when the Inner Line Regulation was erected to be the de facto boundary, which segregate Kachar from what is now known as the Lusai or the Mizo Hills. So what is interesting about the latest incident of violence in 26 July 2021 is that it comes as a stark exemplar of a key term of engagement or agreement between the two states that was arrived as far as 1986 when the IGP level, Inspector General of Police level meeting was held, and an agreement was reached whereby both sides agreed not to deploy armed police on either side. And this is the first time in which this armed deployment happened. Around 200 armed Assam police personnel overran the Central Paramilitary Force, which was deployed to guard the Inner Line Forest, was breached. And as many as 200 armed police entered into the firing there, which is 6 kilometers from Lailapur in Assam, which in effect led to retaliatory attacks. And you have this bloody violence unleashed. As I said, if you look at the larger context in which this unravel, you'll find that incidents of complaints of encroachment and eviction drives was the hallmark of the May 1972 eviction order that Assamese government had in the reserve forest area of Bukchangpui and the Bukchang area, which in effect led to kind of antagonistic positions taken by both sides. The Mizoram side taking that given that the Assam government has acknowledged and recognized the right of the Mizo Hill District Council and subsequently the Mizoram Union Territory to allow the tax proceed which was collected from these areas for augmenting its own internal resources. It was taken as an explicit recognition of the de facto control that the Mizos have on these areas, which otherwise was claimed as falling within the ambit of the Kachar areas by the Assam government. And in May 1974, you have similar eviction drive, which was taken by the Assam government in Kanmon, in Lusaichira, in Ripo, in Bairabi, in Tinglian, Buchang, Paisen, and Vairengte, which is otherwise considered to be a part of Assam. So what is interesting about this is that despite all these conflicting positions on the side of the Assam, that in effect you have encroachers which encroach upon lands in the inner reserve forest area, and that the counterclaims of the Lusais that it is not the Assam proper, as it were, but a part of the traditional historical proprietary rights of the Mizo to settle as well as engage in cultivation that in effect mark some of the important points that government of Mizoram two-man boundary commission, which was constituted in 1972, which gave its report in 1973, pointed out that way back in 1973, as many as 2,684 Mizo settled in this inner line reserve. out of which they cultivated 1,991 acres of land, right? And other tribals which also populated this inner line reserve account for something like 1,008, out of which 503 acres of areas were cultivated. So notwithstanding the counter positioning and the counter complaints that each side engaged in encroachment of land, the kind of ground level de facto practice was that there has been extensive settlement of tribal population in this area, given that these are outliers to Assam proper, and that you hardly had human settlement in the vast spans of forest which encompass this inner line reserve area. And these incidents also led in 2005 to the arrest of Mirul Laskar, a truck driver from Kacha, who was apprehended for not producing ILP, which is required because Lusai Hills, as you know, is a part of the inner line area, which ensures that no indigenous community from outside or foreigner could enter this area without having explicit documentary permit to enter into this. And the result of which is that you have retaliatory attacks as a result of this arrest on the Kachar side around Katlichera in Assam. And in 2007, you also have the arrest of 3 bulldozer operators and 1 JCB operator cultivating Shi Chunga, the first chief ministers of Mizoram paddy field. And the result of which is there was this open eviction as well as threat of arrest of cultivators by the Director General of the Kasar district in Vairengte. So the latest incident, as you know, was in October 2020, which occurred in the Singla Reserve Forest area. And because of this altercation which ensued, it led to sporadic incidents of violence, as well as eviction drives, which led to 12-day blockade of the National Highway 206. So how is it then so problematic? How do you then conceptualize this as a problem of one which is characterized by fluid boundaries and overlapping territory? Fluid boundaries because they are vaguely defined and contingent on the political fortune of the kings or the chiefs. I consider that these areas are important to the extent that they also become the object of state agenda of state making and reclaiming areas which are wasteland in order to augment the state revenue. Remember that in the 18th and 19th century, when the idea of scientific forestry was popularized by the Germans, the idea that this could also be replicated in frontier areas gained traction, especially among the colonialists. And the result of which is that you have the establishment of Forest Department in India in 1864, and the Forest Department of Assam was created in 1868 as a follow-on to fructify the scientific forest project, whereby certain forests which are commercially lucrative would be planted. Those areas would be enclosed upon, reclaimed, and put under exceptional laws, whereby no laws or no man would be allowed to enter into those lands, right? So the kind of pan-Indian laws which are applicable in other parts of India would not be applicable because of the fact that these are exclusive zones of tribal inhabited areas, which the British seeks to protect for a set of reasons. And if you look at, for example, the inner line regulation of 1973, there are 3 explicit projects which, in effect, drive the British project of coming up with inner line regulation, which is enforcing more stringent controls over the commercial relations of our own subjects with the frontier tribes living on the border of our jurisdiction, quote unquote. So there is an element of stringent political as well as security control, which would inform the kind of relationship that unraveled as a result of extensive tea, rubber, or coal mining areas. And because the British had this into objective to augment the state resources, it was considered incumbent on the British to carve out certain areas as forest reserve areas so that more stringent control could be established, right? And the second is, of course, stopping the operation of speculators in caoutchouc. That is to say that rubber speculators, as you know, the rubber was discovered in Bengal for the first time in 1804 and subsequently considered to be a very lucrative commercial as well as trade commodity. And the result of which is that there are so many competitors, European competitors, who in effect showed an eye of interest on these frontier areas. And in order to regulate and stop the operation of speculator, which in effect interfere in the commercial interests of the British and also impinge on intertribal relation in these areas, it was considered that line regulation, for example, should be put in place as a larger project, to regulate the way in which forest reserves are utilized subsequently, right? And finally, you have also the attempt to restrain the spread of tea garden outside the fiscal limit of the British Raj. So if you look at closely, you'll find that the inner line regulation, although was an attempt to demarcate territories beyond which, the capital or state or non-state activities are sought to be controlled, essentially is a matter to outline a set of jurisdictional boundaries of the colonial state. And these jurisdictional boundaries of the colonial state need not imply territorial implication, in the sense that it does not imply on the sovereign territorial claim of indigenous peoples and population in these areas. But subsequently, de facto, as you know, it has important implication on trying to fix borders, which otherwise had been fluid, because you have multiple as well as overlapping tribal chieftainship in these areas, which had extensive overlapping territorial control. Remember that with the expansion of tea garden, with the expansion of rubber plantation, with the exploration as well as the excavation of oil, coal as well as oil in these areas, it in effect infringes on overlapping territorial claims of tribal groups. And the result of which is that you have counter raids from the Nagas, from the Boers, from Nefa areas, and from the Khasis as well as the Garos from the southeastern part. And you also have these Lusais who, in effect, as I have already mentioned, engaged in a series of raids, which culminated in the raid of Alexandrapur Tea Garden. So the result of which is that territoriality attempt by an individual or the state or group to affect, influence, or control people, phenomena, or relationship by delimiting and asserting control over a geographical area becomes a very compelling political project in this part, not only of the state, but also of different tribal groups who in effect are acutely conscious about their traditional historical claims over areas which they consider their own, right? And the result of which is that in order to beat back those security anxieties, establish semblance of law and order, and ensure that security prevail in order to guard and zealously protect the commercial and trade interests of the British, you have a series of military promenades as well as military expedition taken out as a part of the state-making project. And as you know, the state-making project is always a vertical panopticon or a vertical governability, which is sought to be superimposed on tribal indigenous population. And the result of which is that for the first time, if you look at the works of Sanghamitra Mishra and others, you'll find that the idea of mapping the borderland, the idea of cartographic imagination got radically redefined. The state, modern colonial state practice of making borders following a horizontal progression in effect runs in contrary to the indigenous idea of cosmography or map, of the way of seeing the world, as it were, if map making is about mental construct, about subjectively constructing certain social space. It in fact brought into collision the colonial horizontal practice of demarcating or fixating certain territories as their own, which in effect runs counter to vague, amorphous as well as loosely defined boundaries, which are fluid and depend upon the political vicissitude or the political fortune of the kings and the chiefs. If you have a powerful king or if you have a powerful chieftainship in certain tribal pockets, chances are that the extension of those tea estate, of oil, of rubber, of tea plantation would be seen as direct infringement. It would in effect invariably invite retaliation from those tribal groups. And the result of which is that this state making invariably involved the enclosure of the commons, which entailed on, as Winnie Chakul, Thongchai Winnie Chakul, the Thai political historian, consider it as amounting to the silencing of sovereignties. So with the state, in effect, encompassing all these forest areas which had been traditionally used as grounds of hunting, of resource extraction, of securing livelihood for the tribals, you have the enclosure of these areas which led to the dislocation as well as the displacement of the tribals. And the result of which is that over time, as a result of this colonial as well as post-colonial state practice of enclosing the commons or the forest areas, you have an inverted idea about who the encroachers are. In the 1860s and the 1870s, the encroachers into these areas were invariably the colonial Raj. And in the post-independent era, what happened is that the state, in effect, would now consider, thanks to the entrenchment or institutional mediation or protection of these areas through the extraordinary laws which come in the form of Forest Reserve Act, you have the transformation of local population as guardian or as owners of land to becoming encroacher of land, right? So the result of which is that this map-making or territorial fixity unleash a set of overlapping territorial claims which continue to foster embers of violence, bloody conflict across borders, especially in Assam as well as in Mizoram. So what is therefore imperative for us to be mindful is to be mindful of the difficulty, if not impossibility, of fixing fluid boundaries. And this become imperative because the colonial as well as the post-colonial state practice of drawing state boundaries are often based on certain natural markers, okay, which in effect are subjected to overlap, subjected to contestation, as well as subjected to deeply contentious social construction. Look at, for example, the Pemberton imaginary lines of 1835, which in effect was an attempt to draw boundaries between Assam and Manipur, and for that matter with Nagaland and other areas, are roughly imaginary lines which followed certain natural markers, right? Which in effect also become a point of contention as far as 1872, 1873, and subsequently in the 1870s, later part of 1870s. And that led to what Henry Hopkinson, for example, who was the predecessor to Robert H. Keating, the Assam's first chief commissioner, to maintain that Pemberton's argument that the southern tip of Assam continued to be vaguely defined, continued to be subjected to contestation from powerful, dangerous tribes from Lusai Hills and other parts of the tribal territories, continued to be whole ground, as Henry Hopkinson says, that these boundaries continue, as he said, quote unquote, vague, shifty, fluid, and uncertain. So despite the fact that you have 646 pillars drawn along the military outpost south of Kachar, in Chutachura Peak, in Jalnachira, in Monirkal, in Bairabi, and all those areas, they continue to be subjected to being contested precisely because the Mizoram government, for example, now consider that this goes against the grain of people's long-standing traditional and historical practice. And unlike the government of Assam's argument that borders are not based on perception, but are institutionally mediated by rules or laws of the land. And these laws and laws of the land are clearly enunciated under the Inner Line Regulation of 1930, which was amended subsequently in 1933. That should be, as it were, the institutionally mediated boundary between Kachar and Assam. So the government of Mizoram, on the other hand, considered that this is totally against a people-centric view, the idea of what is often called as, the juris possidetis, right? So the possidetis juris or the ut possidetis juris, which actually give premium to possession of law as sanctified or as sanctioned by the law, including customary law, for example, is used as a powerful recourse by the Assam government when it constituted the two-man boundary commission in 1972, which gave its report in 1973, and in 2018, when the government of Assam, in effect, broadened this dialogic space by involving all political parties, including the BJP, to come up with a common ground in order to make an argument that the 1933 boundary line between Assam and Mizoram cannot be accepted because it was considered to be a vertical governability, an act which is superimposed arbitrarily because it has not taken on board the consent or the opinion of the people concerned. So what entails as a result, I'll conclude my lecture in a matter of 5 minutes, 2-3 minutes, not 5 minutes. Therefore, is that you really have to think about, first of all, the frontier model of development, which, quote unquote, in fact, I borrowed this idea of frontier model of development from the idea of Daniel J. Elazar, the eminent federal theorist, who in fact considered that most of modern state, post-colonial state development, in effect, are guided not by attempt to kind of protect or consolidate the rights of tribal societies or traditional societies, but it amounts to the enclosure, dislocation, and displacement of these societies without attempt to build on and modernize them. And it entails, as a consequence, as I have already outlined, what Thongchai Winitsakur calls silencing multiple and overlapping sovereignties. The second terms in which we can possibly think in order to break this logjam or to overcome this contentious model is to also think about, rethink about the possibility of breaking the territorial trap. Ambassador Chinoy has somehow sounded this out when it comes to the idea of sovereignty, which he says he was a bit discomfort because when I use the term sovereignty, I, in effect, try to use this in terms of the internal dimension of the sovereignty, right? So given that you have a very reified, very fixated idea of territorial boundaries within the modern Indian nation state, there are also attempts to be fixated upon a very strict, very well demarcated territorial boundaries, which in effect sometimes infringe about intercommunal harmony as well as intercommunal relationship. And the kind of tension that erupted in the Assam-Mizoram border over a historical period of time would also reinforce that the more you emphasize on this hard line attempt to create exclusive territorial fixated zones by zealously coming up with what Himanta Biswa Sarma would suggest, for example, raising 3 Assam battalion, armed battalion, or parading a kind of armor vehicle along this is in effect to reinforce that there is a statist attempt to make a hardball or a hard-lined positioning when it comes to fixating territories, which in effect somehow become a bone of contention given that you have overlapping territorial claims across Assam and Mizoram. And therefore, it is therefore imperative for constructive dialogue to happen, that this exclusive idea of fixed territories need to be broken down, right, in order to have a more constructive, a more inclusionary framework, which would take into cognizance the traditional and historical rights of people. The third option could also be that hardball positioning or hardline positioning could also be used for electoral purpose. And therefore, it is therefore imperative to really look at critically the kind of grandstanding that Assam government, for example, had engaged itself in parading armored vehicles, trying to raise, the armed battalion, 3 armed battalions, to zealously guard these borders. And that would essentially transform these borders as what is often known in the literature as unruly borders. Vince Sandel and Timothy Michaud, for example, would consider that unruly borders, once they become unruly, which are mutually hostile and inhabited by people belonging to different communities, can actually transform into unruly borders and would spawn very prolonged, violent, bloody conflict. And that is precisely a possibility or a plausible proposition in this, given that the Assam part of the border, which is often called in common political discourse as the Barak Valley, is inhabited by large concentration of the Muslim population. And the kind of political messaging that is going around on either side, whether it's on the Assam side or whether it is on the Mizoram side, is that these areas are being used for electoral purposes by political parties because they have been a target of flushing out or evicting, illegal Bangladeshi immigrants. And this type of argument, political rhetoric, can also be used by political parties, especially, for example, the BJP, given the fact that the BJP had not been very successful in securing impressive electoral victory in these areas. In the 3 areas which, in effect, share boundaries with Mizoram, for example, Hailakandi, Karimganj, and Kachar, you have 15 assembly segments, out of which the BJP in the last election secured just 6. Okay, so there is a very desperate attempt to kind of shore up this type of conflict with religious fervor, which can be used very effectively to polarize the electorate and to draw on a particular brand of politics, which in the long run could transform this area as unruly borders. And therefore, it is very imperative, therefore, to emphasize the interdependent border or the interdependent nature of this border in this area. And this is imperative because you have the National Highway 306, which runs from Silchar to Kolasip, right? Which in effect is the life link between Assam and Mizoram, in as much as it is also a kind of a two-way traffic of goods or trade between the two, given that Mizoram is now being projected as the major gateway to Southeast Asia and a part of a critical component of India's East policy. So to what extent can these borders be allowed to transform as unruly borders remains to be critically seen, and it is incumbent on students of politics, on practitioners of everyday politics, to be mindful that there are every possibility of converting these areas into unruly borders, and the stake for us, therefore, is to reclaim this area of interdependent borders, given the fact that these areas are very fluid and they continue to be informed by security anxiety and overlapping territorial claims, which makes that this border continue to remain politically, geostrategically important for India, if at all a very purposeful and meaningful ECIS policy were to be materialized in this border. I think with this, I'll close my talk for now. I'll be open to question and answers.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that very enlightening talk. In fact, as I heard you, you seem to give a very magisterial overview of all the issues that have been bedeviling this part of the country, and you did it in a very objective, dispassionate manner, which is also more credit to you, and a very professorial manner in which you were able to dissect some of these key issues. The impression that you left me with was that these borders or so-called borders between states are today more than just a particular kind of border. For instance, there is the historical perception of a border. There is also a constitutional perception of the same border. To add to that, there is an emotive perception of the border. Then there is also a de facto perception of the border. And the fifth is actually the political perception of the border. So I was able to sift through your talk and identify 5 different ways of looking at these borders, or interpreting them or reinterpreting them to suit a particular sort of viewpoint and give it a particular slant. I personally think that you were also very correct when you said that these are geopolitically, geographically very important states of the Union of India, the Republic of India. They are our border states. Most, if not all, at least some parts of their borders abut international borders, and therefore the fulfillment of India's geostrategic destiny, especially the fullest realization of the Act East policy, cannot be achieved without these matters settling down. It cannot be left simmering, and that would be to our great disadvantage. Having said that, I think that the way forward, and I'd like to hear your views on this, would be to see if we can divest ourselves of all the 5 alternatives and optional ways of looking at the borders, and perhaps think of a new way of addressing this issue. So we don't want to look at it selectively as either historical or constitutional or emotional or de facto or political in terms of the potential for votes, etc. But is it possible to look at these zones once again as some kind of buffer zones where the states in question get together and form some kind of joint commission which looks at the interests of all the people who have a stake in those areas, and prevent these areas from descending into conflict or becoming unruly areas as you described them. One of the reasons why I had earlier on kind of suggested that you reword the title of your talk, and you were right in pointing that out to the audience, that I was not in favor of the use of the term sovereign to speak of either territoriality or boundaries, because to my mind, the only sovereign in the case of India is the government of India. In the old days, it was the British colonial government, and otherwise it was the ruling sort of kings and emperors and things of the sort. So a sovereign really is a power that has control over the country and over its territory and boundaries. And certainly it is not my contention, nor would I like to concede that point, that it is for states to decide what exactly is sovereignty. Because if they can have the latitude to decide on sovereignty vis-a-vis an internal border with another state, they may well start talking of sovereignty on the other flank which abuts an international border. And states cannot have sovereignty over borders in that sense. So I hope you understand why I had suggested that that was not acceptable, even in terms of intellectual or theoretical clarity for me. And I'm so glad that you reworded the title of your talk. So please do tell me if there is any possibility of such states coming together to form joint commission whereby they put some of these issues in abeyance for the foreseeable future. Look at the commercial, and de facto interests of people who might be living there. If they have to be relocated, look at it in a holistic and responsible way, so that their immediate livelihoods and things are not affected. But that might perhaps be the way forward, to create some kind of joint buffers where it's not one or the other state that uses the lathi, so to speak, to decide what these things are, because this fluidity of the past has been enormous. You described it so well, the expanding plantations and tea estates, and then the inner line areas where people required special permission to go to. It was also a question of safety and security for the plantations and others who were also often at the receiving end of tribal groups that descended from the hills. And this is a story of many parts of the Northeast when we look at it closely, that there were traditional raids, if not raids, traditional demands made of plains people for annual, so-called posa, whether the British often gave some kind of posa to some tribes to help them survive or to engage in less marauding is besides the point, whether that can truly be called posa. But my point here is that it worked both ways. When we speak of traditional presence and rights, there are layers of history here and behavior also. So kindly comment on that point, and then I want to throw it open to bring in, maybe I'll first bring in General Bipin Bakshi, my colleague who has served in the Northeast, and I'm sure he has something to share on this subject. Then Dr. Pushpita Das, then Colonel D.P.K. Pillai. So you may keep what I said as one of the questions to be addressed later. Over to you, General Bakshi.
So thank you very much, sir, and thank you, Professor, for a very interesting talk. And so many items have again emerged in DG's comments. Now, this issue of overlapping territories, which you have gone on talking about, we were talking in historical times of empires which abutted each other. There were no lines in this zone. Where did the lines come from? They came from the Treaty of Westphalia. The Westphalian concept with fixed boundaries were decided after 5 years of negotiation. There were 108 delegations after the 30-year war and the 80-year war, where they decided to get together. For the first few meetings, they were only deciding how to hold the meeting. Who would be the head of the delegation? How would the meetings take place? So 5 years they negotiated, and they came up with the Treaty of Westphalia. Now here they are drawing lines arbitrarily as colonial powers without taking into account the historical sensitivities, the way annual tributes are paid, the way the frontier zone domination or utilization would change even seasonally. One tribe would come in from during the winter. In the monsoon, there'll be another time. In the last talk we had on this, Mr. G.K. Pillai, the ex-Home Secretary, had mentioned one such issue between Bangladesh and Meghalaya. Now, these lines which were drawn, which have just been discussed, including were of administrative convenience to the British or the extent of the patrolling breach. So it is no small coincidence that the Kashar levy was raised in the manner DG was just saying. To protect the plantations which the Britishers were doing, they raised something called a Kashar levy. And now that later transformed into today, which is a huge fighting force called the Assam Rifles. Why was all this done? So it was more of administrative convenience and the security capabilities of the forces they had that some of these lines were drawn. And now you're calling them unruly borders. Even the Durand line was, somewhat similar. You've drawn a line which is running through a particular nation, I would say, which is running through a population, and the Pashtuns don't recognize it. Same goes for the Ridgeway line, which has divided the northern part of Afghanistan, where Uzbeks and Kazakhs and Kyrgyz people suddenly found themselves on two sides of a line. So the festering sores which have been created by this arbitrary method of drawing lines is what is today you are now calling it as unruly borders. So rightfully, as you have mentioned, maybe we need to take a new look at all this. But how do we move forward when there are some fixated positions from both sides who are looking at those lines as etched in stone? Is what we need to look at, and maybe we can throw some more light on it. Thank you.
Thank you, General Bakshi. Dr. Pushpita Das, I'm sure you have something to add to this discourse. Over to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Professor Hausing, for such a enlightening lecture. We, as you know, that we are doing a project on this topic itself, subject itself, and even though our job is very limited one, but we are also quite, we want to know how exactly we can, arrive at some kind of solution as far as this Northeast interstate borders dispute in Northeast is concerned. And going back to the history, we have seen that there have been so many commissions which were constituted, but they gave their recommendations, but one of the state governments did not, follow through and did not accept it because it was of, it was not beneficial for them. So as you rightly said, that politics is a major factor, which to a large extent acts as a hurdle in the solution of these interstate borders, I think. And another thing I would also like to say here is that as far as Mizoram border is concerned, we also must look at the narrative of the tribals, because once you, if you look at the Mizo border also, in Nagaland, we know there is a 16-point agreement, and of course there was a Naga-Hyderabad agreement wherein, the claims of the Naga leaders were put on record. But in Mizoram case also, we have seen that when Mr. Bortoloy he went with his colleagues in 1947 and discussed with the Mizo leaders there, they had also spoken about the fact that the reserve forest which has been given to Assam should be reverted to them. So there is also, these factors which needs to be taken into account. The narrative which is put forward by the Mizos also, when we have to talk about a solution to these interstate boundary issues. But again, the fact is that we do say that there should be a political will, but how to arrive at a political will is the difficult issue here. So what, according to you, because you do refer to a two-man boundary commission which was set up in 1972, I would like you to elaborate a little bit on that. What were its recommendations and why it was not been implemented as far as Mizoram Assam border is concerned? That's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Pushpita Das. May I request Colonel D.P.K. Pillai to step in and share his views? Colonel Pillai too is familiar with the Northeast and is by all reckoning quite popular there, a frequent visitor as well. Colonel Pillai, especially because you're also dealing with several parts of the project that we're doing at IDSA. Colonel D.P.K. Pillai.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, sir, and also to listen to Professor Hausing's very detailed, like you said, very professorial, very educative, very eye-opening. In many ways, he took us through the entire. My only small question is, like, you also raised this in the meeting with all the chief secretaries the other day when we held the Northeastern. You had also raised it that if a country is capable of settling its borders with the international boundaries settled, and if states like Kerala can, Kerala and Karnataka, or between Maharashtra and Karnataka, Belgaum and Kasaragod are, districts which are very prosperous, they can actually settle them. What is it that eludes, like if you look at the population of Mizoram, is even lesser than one of the sub-districts of Delhi. It's about, 10 to 12 lakhs. And the kind of violence that is capable of being inflicted there, there's no limit to how much back we can go, And given that the population is quite less, I wonder why is it that we cannot really arrive at a solution? And like DG had said, there's no going back. If you want to go back, you can even go back to 600 years, like the Tibetans, like the Chinese like to do. Go back to a small period of time when they actually paid. That's given the fact that 15th of August 1947, all existing treaties and everything came to naught, and you had an entirely new dispensation. And why is that we can't really, arrive at a decision in this? And why is this Indian state also not showing an inclination to settle this matter? This is something that eludes me, having read through this. Not only the state, why is the central government also unable to actually impose its decision on this matter? I'll be grateful to hear your point.
Thank you. That's also a good question, but we have to also keep in mind that things do not remain frozen. For instance, 1947 is a particular point of inflection, but it is possible that the ground situation is one that is evolving constantly, and therefore it's not only evolved before 1947, but also in terms of de facto situation, perhaps evolved post 1947. But Professor, you have the floor. You can address whatever it is that the four of us have raised or commented on, and then maybe we can open it up to our attendees. I do not see so far any questions. Maybe you have answered all the questions that they might possibly raise, but I'm sure this is far more complex an issue than that. Over to you.
Yeah, I think breaking the impasse on the border and arriving at a mutually agreeable solution would entail political will, which is very, very important, which seems to be lacking because either side, especially some side, seems to be playing a particular brand of politics, which is not very conducive to resolving the stalemate. I'll give you a pointer to this. And this is precisely where the challenge of, charting out political discourse or electoral discourse need to be seriously relooked. One is, of course, the fact that these so-called Barak Valley areas are Muslim-dominated areas. And despite the anticipation that it would entail, high turnout in terms of the excluded list of people in the NRC, remember that these areas, Kachar, Hailakandi, and Karimganj return hardly around 7 to 8% of the list which are excluded, which otherwise was expected to be high. And now the kind of impression and the perception on both sides is that these areas are concentrated by illegal Muslim immigrants. And given that this stigma or this perception is deeply embedded in both the popular psyche across the border, how do you then break the logjam in ways which would carve out a very objective political engagement across the two borders? I think it depends upon both sides of the political elites to come up with a more inclusionary, a more broad-based, engagement, which is also historically sensitive to the unsettled, fluid nature of boundaries across these two areas. And that is precisely the point that I keep on emphasizing. If at all a practical, mutually agreeable solution is to be arrived at, it has to be a give and take. And this give and take would start from the historical fact, as I have pointed out, that way back in 1972, when these two-man boundary commission constituted, find out this observation that more than 2,000 Mizos are already in settlement in these areas, occupying more than 1,900 acres. And you have as many as, slightly over 1,000 and more than 500 acres of land being occupied in this inner land reserve. The numbers must have been much, much higher now. And we do not have a very authoritative account of how many actually live inside this inner line. Remember that this inner line reserve continue to be very isolated areas where people really we do not have the, personnel as well as the manpower to penetrate deep into the jungles. And given that you have this de facto settlement already in place, and the problem areas are around the Lailapur, Vairangte areas where you have more visible presence of these inhabited communities, which led to a series of eviction drive. Remember that Sarbanan Sonowal has instituted the Brahma Commission. And this Brahma Commission has undertaken very extensive eviction drive, and the fallout of which is seen very recently in Darang district, which led to the killing of two eviction protesters, counter eviction protest, right? And you have as many as 1,200 to 1,300 families already being evicted, and there are appeals in the court line, and we do not know how this court ruling might pan out and have implication on the kind of encroachment, quote unquote, which play out in the Assam-Kachar border. This is to be, keenly look out for, if at all we have to have a very good guide to resolve the impasse there. How do you then reconcile the status security imperative and people-centric idea of attending to traditional historical rights? And this is precisely where I flag the idea of ut possidetis juris, people who have possession under law. And that is precisely where the contention of the Mizo District Council in 1965 and subsequently the Manipur Legislative Assembly of 1973 holds water, which is that given that Assam government has allowed the proceeds of taxation levied from these cultivated areas to be used for augmenting the revenue resources of the Union Territory and hitherto the District Council of Mizoram, it should now be used as possibly a starting point to negotiate. Obviously, the Mizo would also have to give away, some of the things which have direct bearings on intercommunal relationship across these areas. The other point, which I think is also very important, is that despite all attempts, to open up avenues of dialogue across the chief secretary level or across the IGP-DZ or the DFO in these two regions, or chief conservator of lands, or the director general of land revenue and settlement in these two areas, somehow the recommendation to institute a chief ministerial level dialogue has not actualized. And I think this is something that we have to look out for. And to what extent would the central be willing to negotiate and play a neutral observer in ensuring that the ground rules is followed? I think to the extent that what would be the legitimacy of the central paramilitary force which guard this reserve forest area, ensuring that the 1986 agreement reached at the IGP level of not deploying armed police personnel is strictly enforced on the ground, is something which I think can be a leverage to start with. And I think this, once it is put very firmly as a practice across interstate police interaction or engagement, I think that could possibly be the way forward in order to lay out a peaceful atmosphere which is conducive for give and take dialogue to happen. So in that sense, to what extent would Assam government be able to dissect its political rhetoric in ways which is not hijacked by electoral agenda would be important, in as much as the large-hearted nature of Assamese government to give away some areas which has been historically, if you look at, for example, the department, the forest department annual report of say 1872, 1873, 1874, which in effect explicitly recognized that the so-called inner line reserve are beyond the outer limit of Assam proper, as it were. So can that be a starting point, for example, to be large-hearted enough to concede to the point that this inner land reserve has been historically, traditionally owned by the Mizos, and there has to be certain give away from the Assam government in order to ensure that at least the de facto line as it is practiced now is maintained without inviting the rat. When there is a hardline positioning across the border, it invites retaliation. You cannot possibly think about 200 odd armed personnel entering into another area where the situation is already volatile and coming back without being harmed at all. I think this is something which is very unfortunate, but which happened and which could have been avoided in the future, so that a possible breaking of this territorial trap as well as breaking of the impasse happen in the future.
So thank you for those clarifications. It's obviously a work in progress. A lot of what we are discussing is not only being discussed in the state governments at various levels, not necessarily, as you suggested, at the apex level, which may be, as you seem to hint, more desirable, but nevertheless being discussed in various, state level structures. And some of it is also copiously sub judice. So it does not behove us to try and take any particular position on whether at the end of it all, a de facto, border is more preferable to the historical one or the constitutional one or the emotional one, or for that matter, the political one. I, for one, cannot venture or hazard a view on that matter. I suppose you probably can a little more than I can, because you are also from those parts. It's like asking me if I have a view on whether the Kathiawar Peninsula should be or should not be part of Gujarat, So that's history. We were under the reorganization of states, we became a fundamental part of Gujarat in 1960, and parts of the state of Gujarat also went to Rajasthan. For instance, Mount Abu used to be in Gujarat earlier. Now it's part of Rajasthan. And we still visit Mount Abu the same way. If we have properties there, we still possess it. We still enjoy the place without really much of a thought for whether it is actually Gujarat or Rajasthan. So I think in the larger interest of the nation, a broader view is always more desirable as compared to a narrow parochial view that is mired in local sentiments. At the end of the day, I feel we have to rise above it all at some stage in a cooperative manner. And at the same time, I did say, if there is any likelihood, we should examine the possibility of creating some genuine buffers where state governments put their heads together and try and do justice to the interests of all the people there. Having said that, I personally have no further questions to ask of you. So far, I have not received any other queries. I don't think I'm missing out any. Am I, Dr. Das? You're, maybe you are more hawk-eyed than I am as far as the Q&A box is concerned, but I don't see any. I think people are also overwhelmed by the complexity, Professor, of this issue. They don't want to jump into, tread uncharted waters. But this is only the beginning for us to engage you. I, for one, have found you extremely articulate today, extraordinarily well informed, and the very easygoing manner in which you have engaged us today speaks volumes for your own erudition. So with this, I would like to simply convey a very big thank you on behalf of the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, and all my colleagues are grateful to you equally. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Chinoy, and the excellent team.
Thank you. Let's stay in touch.
Okay, sure. Okay,
Thank you.
bye for now.
Bye-bye for now.
Thank you very much.